Well, it's a pleasure to follow two combative speakers in comparison with which I can be made to look moderate and consensual. It's a curiously retrogressive bill, this, because one of the policies that made Labour unelectable in the 1980s is determined opposition to the introduction of the right to buy. Of course, the numbers are very different now, so possibly it may not have quite the same toxic effect on the Labour Party as their attitude did then. But I also have a curious sense of déjà vu, because I had a part in persuading the Thatcher government to include housing associations in the Housing Bill of 1979, which gave to housing association tenants the same rights that were proposed for council tenants, and for the same reasons as David Melding has outlined, a very good thing it was too in increasing the diversity of ownership in estates. This is an ideological bill because it's always seemed rather absurd to me in terms of social policy that a government should subsidise the bricks and mortar rather than those who need help with being able to afford a roof over their heads. And it's, of course, an extremely expensive way of catering for a social need, actually to build houses as opposed to provide people with the means of paying rent. And the figures are unambiguous that this bill is totally irrelevant to the solution to the housing crisis which we have in Wales. Just look at the figures. I mean, local authorities sold under the right to buy provisions last year only 141 houses. Registered social landlords sold 133 under the right to acquire legislation. They sold voluntarily 299. So the total number of houses in local authority ownership and RSL ownership which were sold under the right to buy legislation was only 274 in a housing stock of 1.4 million houses in the whole of Wales. So clearly this has no significance at all beyond an ideological one for the Labour Party, now reverting to type after 20 or 30 years. And if we look at the stock figures, this is quite dramatic. You know, local authorities currently own 87,000 properties for rent. RSLs own 137,000. There are privately rented houses in Wales, 202,000. Owner occupation, nearly 1 million. And what we're talking about here is 274 houses or flats that have been sold under the right to buy legislation in a year. I mean, yes.
Yes, between the 1st of April 1981 and the 31st of March 2016, 139,000 local authority housing association homes were sold off. That's 45%. None of them were replaced.
It's true. Over the time period involved, yes, 139,000. In the same period, the number of houses or flats that are rented privately has risen by 110,000. So the market changes, and there is a housing crisis, which for the reason which David Melding pointed out. We have a perfect storm in a sense because we have very significant restrictions on building through the planning legislation on the one hand, and we know that with the immigration figures there's tremendous pressure on demand, as well as for the reasons of splitting up households and single occupation. There is an increased demand for property, and we know that despite all the talk of austerity that we constantly hear in this chamber, the vast increase in the amount of money in circulation through quantitative easing has actually fed largely into asset prices, and there's been a ripple effect that has worked outwards from London and the South East. So if we want to solve the housing problem, as of course we all do, then we have to look elsewhere than this measure to achieve that result. But what I find so extraordinary about this is that this has been a great liberating policy over the years for hundreds of thousands of people who wanted to own their own houses. And the fact that they were in council ownership or social housing ownership didn't mean that they would be moving out to exercise their desire to own their own property and then making their properties available to others who needed them. Properties are locked up for generations often by people who live in local authority housing or social housing. That doesn't in any way mean that you are going to be able to satisfy the social objectives that we all agree about. I was in favour of property-owning democracy, and I still am, and I'm in favour, as Neil McEvoy pointed out, of aspirational working-class people being able to participate in it.